A number of years ago, I was part of a church that had a fairly charismatic pastor. In particular, this pastor appealed to young men. And through his leadership, many of these young men that you maybe wouldn't expect to typically become Christian, they were led to God through this man's leadership. By all appearances, these young men had rich faiths. They even had leadership qualities and charisma of their own. And many took risks in their walks of obedience with Jesus. It was really exciting to see all of these sorts of things going on in the church. But then the pastor left. Not because there was any problem or anything of that sort, just it was time for the pastor to move on. And as is typical and wise of pastors, he sort of distanced himself from his former flock so that the new pastor coming in could establish his own leadership in that place in the church. But in that process, over the course of the next several months, really even over the course of about a year, several of those young men hit some really rough spots in their faith. The new pastor just didn't really seem to fill the void, at least for them, of the old pastor. The new pastor had his own ministry and his own style, his own giftings. And those were very different from that of his predecessor. And he didn't have the same sort of charisma with these young men. So soon the young men began to drift. First, they stopped attending church. Then they began to distance themselves from their small groups and eventually even started to pull away from a lot of their Christian friendships as well. And finally, several of them even renounced their association with Christ altogether. Later, one of those men, reflecting on what had happened, he looked back and he made the comment that he had thought that he had this really strong faith in God. But what he realized now was that most of that faith, if not all of that faith, had really been wrapped up in that pastor. Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon story in many churches. Someone comes to faith in a church, and by all appearances, their faith seems to be very rich and strong, burning bright in many different ways. By all appearances, they are Christians who have been planted in really good soil, ready to reap that bountiful harvest that Ron mentioned when he read the passage from this morning. But then something happens in that church. Every couple of years, we hear of stories. Often the ones that make the news are from mega churches. But we hear about a megachurch dividing or something happening in those congregations, and we hear about Christians being hurt in that process because of something that went on with the pastor there. Maybe the pastor just moves on. Maybe there's some sort of a failing that the pastor is involved with. But in a matter of months afterwards, what we often hear about are how the faiths of so many in those congregations seem to wither and then die, revealing, just again, like the parable of Jesus, as he shared, that the soil of many of these Christians really was rocky soil, and their roots really were not very deep at all. Well, our passage for this morning in Exodus that we're going to be looking into might be the first written example of a group of God followers being so wrapped up in their leader, in his personality, in their charisma, that when their leader is not in the picture, they kind of lose it, basically. So please get out your Bible so you can follow along with us this morning. Get ready to take some notes. We will be talking about these things in the discipleship groups for this week as well. Now, as we've been talking about for the past several weeks, Moses has been up on Mount Sinai. He's been up on the mountain. He's been receiving the law from God. In Exodus 24, 18, it specifically says that Moses was up on the mountain by himself with God for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, that could mean he was there for a literal 40 days and 40 nights, or it could just be sort of the Bible's way of saying that he was there for a really long time. Moses was away for a really long time, and regardless, it seems that Moses had withdrawn from the community of the people for over a month. So a very long period of time that he was away. And nobody knew what happened to Moses. Nobody else was allowed up on the mountain. It was just Moses by himself, and the people had no word what was going on with Moses during that time period. But finally, God finished. God finished communicating everything he wanted to communicate with Moses. And then in Exodus 31, verse 18, we read, "When the Lord finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the terms of the covenant, written by the finger of God." So God himself had inscribed the words of the covenant on these 2 tablets. And many commentators believe that the reason that there were 2 tablets is actually for the same reason that there are 2 of any sort of agreement that anybody may enter into. I mean, remember, this was a covenant. This was a covenant between God and the people. Well, when you make a covenant, when you make an agreement, there's usually a copy for the person you're making the agreement with, and then a copy for yourself. And so many commentators believe that both of these tablets were inscribed front and back, each as a copy of the other. One copy was for God, and one copy was for the people, the copies of this covenant. Now, we don't really know that for sure. I mean, it doesn't say that anywhere, but that idea does make some sense to us. So God gave the law, the covenant, to the people of Israel. And it was ready for Moses to actually present it to them when he came down the mountain. But unfortunately, the people had not been patient in their waiting. Because in Exodus 32, verse 1, we read this. "When the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. 'Come on,' they said, 'make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt.'" Now, it's important for us to understand sort of what the mindset was of the people of Israel at this particular point in their history. They had, of course, been through a lot up to this point. They've been led out of Egypt through these miracles that God had performed. They crossed the Red Sea, again, a miraculous work by God. They'd been led through the desert by a pillar of fire and pillar of smoke. They'd been given provision by God for water and for food from heaven. And this was a regular thing, a daily thing for them. And they had fought this battle with the Amalekites, and they had won that battle through the power of God. And everything that they had seen, everything that had been done, all of these things had been done through the leadership and the power of God working through this man, Moses. Moses was basically channeling the power and the authority of God. So the people relied on Moses, understandably, even if at times they disagreed with him or argued with him. Moses had become a fixture of their understanding and their focus of God working in each of their lives. But now Moses was gone. He was gone. They were living in the middle of the desert with no leader, with no home, no way of eating or drinking water other than what God was providing on a daily basis. They were vulnerable, and they likely very much felt that way. Were others, like the Amalekites, just waiting and watching to attack them when they didn't know it? Would God continue to provide for their sustenance when Moses wasn't with them? Had Moses injured himself? Had he died? Or worse, had Moses just abandoned them? Again, they just didn't know. Where would they go? What would they do? Who would lead them when Moses wasn't around. In Moses' absence, the congregation of people were likely frightened and uncertain. They were without clear and distinctive leadership or direction, and in that void, they sought to fill and satisfy their nervousness and their fear. They wanted to do something about this absence of Moses. And we see their attempt to fill that void right here in verse 1, as they asked Aaron to make some gods for them to lead them. And so Aaron, he actually complied. We read in the next few verses that Aaron did this. He gathered the gold up from all the people, and he created a golden calf. Now, please note, this was not an intentional decision of Israel to try and turn from God, to try and make another god and follow another god. That really was not their intention, to specifically go in the direction of idolatry. The people were not looking to change religions. They weren't really looking to follow another god. And we know this because right after Aaron created this calf, we read this in Exodus 32, verse 4. It says, "When the people saw it," the golden calf, "they exclaimed, 'O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" So the people, they acknowledged their deliverance from Egypt. They acknowledged that the power that took, there was no denying to them that this was the work of God. But they were connecting their deliverance with gods associated with this new idol and calling that the Lord. In the next verse, we read this. Aaron saw how excited the people were, so he built an altar in front of the calf. Then he announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord." Now, several commentators have actually suggested that the idolatry that Israel was in, this actual idolatry that they stepped into, really started before Moses ever even went up onto the mountain. It didn't start here. It started before, much earlier on. Their idolatry actually started with Israel idolizing Moses himself, which I think makes sense. And if you think about it, I think this does make sense and hopefully makes sense to you. Because the only thing that changed in those 40 days when Moses was up on the mountain, the only thing that changed was Moses was receiving the law and he was gone from their presence. Nothing else happened. There was no drama in the camp. There was no attack. Nothing else was going on. The only thing that happened is that Moses was absent from being amongst the people. But if the removal of Moses from the scene is what caused this crisis of idolatry, that would suggest that the people of Israel had come to place a level of trust and security and even reverence in Moses that should have remained with God. Even Aaron, the guy who was supposed to be the high priest, he got sucked into all this stuff. Now perhaps Aaron was suffering from the same fears that all the people were suffering from. Maybe that was the issue. Perhaps there was a lot of peer pressure that was going on, just pressuring Aaron to create this golden calf. Or maybe Aaron was just trying to delay the mob and try and prevent them from doing something even more crazy in this situation. And maybe he thought that, creating this calf, that may not be good, but it's just a fairly minor thing. He was still calling it the Lord. He was still saying it was God. Maybe he thought that wasn't really that big of a deal. But ultimately, Aaron gave in to the demands of the people, and he compromised in his leadership responsibilities. And have no doubt that Aaron was guilty of the same sin of all of Israel. It was no minor thing. It actually says this in Deuteronomy 9, verse 20. Moses said this, "The Lord was so angry with Aaron that he wanted to destroy him too. But I, Moses, prayed for Aaron and the Lord spared him." So Aaron, like everyone else, had committed a direct violation of the second commandment. Aaron and all the people of Israel committed idolatry. And God was displeased to the point that we read in Exodus 32:10 that he told Moses that he intended to wipe out the entire nation, just totally be done with them in verse 10. And it wasn't until Moses actually begged for God's forgiveness and in his mercy in verse 11 that God actually relented and he ceased and he decided to not pour out utter destruction on the entire nation. Now, fortunately, Moses, during this whole time, leading up to getting the Ten Commandments and afterwards, Moses was not trying to be idolized by the people. He wasn't trying to do that. He was not trying to be the guy that everybody was looking to for answers or support or as somehow being their only way of connecting to God. Moses didn't really even seem to want to be their leader at all in many cases. Now, unfortunately, the same thing can't be said for every pastor that is out there. There are pastors who do want to be idolized. They want the attention. They want the adoration. They want to be hailed as prophets and Moses-like type of leaders. These are very dangerous men. And if you ever come across somebody like that, you should run. I mean, these are dangerous pastors. But Moses was not a spiritually abusive leader like this. And Moses was not trying to make everything about him. And I think that most pastors out there are similarly not trying to make it all about them. They're not spiritually abusive in their leadership. However, Moses still failed to prevent the people from idolizing him. He failed to have the leaders in place who in his absence would have been equipped or mature enough to continue to carry God's vision forward for the people. He failed to advance the spiritual maturity of the people to the point that they could distinguish between truth and idolatry when they came across it. But while you could fault Moses for this, we shouldn't blame him too much because, of course, the people had just been brought out of Egypt. Moses had only really been with the people for just a few months here. I mean, the type of spiritual transformation and maturity that was really needed in the people would take most churches years, if not decades, to really accomplish. So we can't be too hard on Moses. However, it is in this that I think that many pastors, if not most pastors, today do commonly fail. They may not be seeking to be idolized, but they don't do a good enough job of deflecting being idolized by their congregations or equipping the congregations to rely on each other or on God more so than on them. One way you can actually spot idolatry of a pastor within a church is to see what happens when that pastor isn't there. What happens in the church? Maybe it's for one Sunday. Maybe it's for an extended vacation. Maybe it's when the pastor leaves the church entirely. If there is a sizable change in participation or attendance based on the presence or the absence of that pastor, if ministries seem to fall apart when the pastor is not around, if people in the congregation tend to sort of slack off in their Christian responsibilities and their walks when they don't hear from the pastor on a regular basis, if these types of things are happening in a church, then that would suggest that a congregation has come to a place where they have begun to idolize their pastor, at least in some capacity. And again, that can happen whether the pastor intends it or not. There's actually a regional church that a number of years ago sought to plant another church. They wanted to plant a church about 30 minutes or so away from their main building. So they acquired some property. They hired another pastor. They supported this new church by providing a portion of their congregation to be in attendance. They supported the salaries. And the idea was to do all of this until that church got on its feet. But the church plant actually failed. Not because there was something wrong with the new pastor, not because there was something wrong with this pastor's teachings, but because everybody wanted to go to the church where the original pastor was preaching. They sought out his charisma and his style and his leadership. Even if they had to drive further, whatever it was, they wanted that thing from their original pastor. And so the church didn't survive as it had been originally intended. And to me, that suggests that the congregation had, in some capacity, and maybe just a small part, but that they had actually come to idolize their pastor in some ways. Because the presence or the absence of that one individual was what led to the failure of that church plant succeeding as it should have been. And that idolatry prevented a healthy way of this church, new church growing in the region to advance the kingdom of God. But in a very real sense, even the problem with this regional church, in a very real sense, the problem is not with the pastors or with the leaders of these churches. That's really not where the problem is. The problem was and is actually with the people. It's actually your responsibility and my responsibility as men and women, Christians who are following people, to not turn men or women that we respect or we admire or that we follow into idols. It's our responsibility to do that. And again, that goes for me as well, because there are people that I follow, so I have this responsibility. We can't let these individuals take the place that God alone should have in our lives. The challenge is, and the difficulty is, that we tend to be drawn to pastors and drawn to leaders who are larger than life, who are sensational in some way, who are desirable, who are emotionally invigorating for us. And the more we get caught up in the success of a leader, of the profound teachings of a leader, of how we are inspired by them, the more likely we are to idolize those leaders. And the more we idolize those leaders and those pastors, the more damage it does to us and to other people when that individual inevitably moves on or inevitably fails in some way. We set ourselves up in the same sort of way that the people did with Moses at Mount Sinai, to basically have a total meltdown when that leader is no longer around or no longer available or disappoints us in some way. The people of Israel had come to idolize Moses. That was their first problem. But the second problem was that now in their absence, how they sought to fill that void. Now, the golden calf may have in fact resembled one of the gods of Egypt, or maybe it looked like one of the gods of one of the surrounding nations. We don't know for sure. It may have done that. But it seems that with this idol, the people of Israel incorporated in a new understanding of what in their minds this God approved of or didn't approve of. And with that change in understanding about God, there was a change in how they worshiped God. Remember, it wasn't too long earlier, just a few chapters earlier, and at this point in their own time frame, about a month or so beforehand, that God had instructed them to consecrate themselves, to purify themselves by washing and practicing sexual abstinence. That was the precedent that God specifically commanded that his people do. He'd already established that. This was the behavior that they were to follow in his presence. But now, just a month or so later, with their new understanding about God, their way of being in God's presence changed entirely. It changed to revelry. It changed to indulgence. It says this in Exodus 32, verse 6. The people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. After this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And the understanding here is that the people were engaging in hedonistic, in self-indulging types of pleasures. Drunkenness and likely sexual pleasures as well. In Exodus 32, verse 25, it says that the people were running wild and they were out of control. Again, this is very opposite of the behavior that God had clearly commanded of them back in Exodus chapter 19. When we idolize something, that changes how we worship. It impacts us in much the same way. Another way you can spot idolatry in a church is when a church starts to do things that have no precedence, no prior example in God's word. Things that are not in accordance with what God has expressly commanded, and maybe be in direct opposition to something that God has said. We all know that there are churches out there that actually honor or even justify certain types of sin. Maybe it's sexual sin, maybe it's greed, or even hatred. There are churches who can be more clearly distinguished by what they hate and what they are angry about than any sort of love at all for anybody. Churches who endorse sexual sin or bless greed or thrive on hatred have stepped into idolatry. There are churches that will give time for people, maybe people of a different religion or whatever, to speak from their pulpits on a Sunday. These churches have stepped into idolatry. There are churches who will avoid preaching about or speaking about certain biblical subjects because maybe those ideas are unpopular, maybe they are considered unethical by many in the culture, or maybe even illegal by that particular nation. Now, if our culture, the general culture, wants to call certain parts of Scripture unethical, certain ideas unethical, I mean, they have every right to do that. It's a free country. They can kind of do whatever they want. But when a church adopts the culture's principles over biblical principles, that church has stepped into idolatry. When a church takes unscriptural things and says, this or that is how we're now going to worship and how we're going to honor God, that is an indication that a church has stepped into idolatry. No different from Israel mashing in all these ideas of revelry and indulgence into their worship of God. They have polluted their understanding of God, and they've polluted the worship of God to the point that it really isn't worship of God anymore at all. But again, the problem in these situations is only partially with the pastors and the leaders. A big part of the problem is actually with those of us who allow or tolerate pastors or leaders who promote these unbiblical ideas. After all, a leader can't lead if nobody's following them. But we tend to idolize people or practices that somehow show us God in the sensational. We tend to do that. We want to be able to plant a seed and immediately, miraculously, see that plant growing. We want to see the miracles. We want to be swept up in the excitement. We call that success. But unfortunately, we will often accept those types of successes even if we have to compromise on biblical accuracy, spiritual maturity, or even staying power of those things. We'll turn a blind eye to what's dangerous or what is sinful, either because the things that we're looking at are kind of novel or interesting, or because we want to do them ourselves, or because maybe the pastor's got a really great success in all of these other areas, and they're a charismatic leader. So we just sort of ignore those other things. But whether it is the common Christian, common everyday Christian, or it is a Christian leader, whether it is us or somebody else, the quality of a Christian is not in their charisma before a crowd. It's not in the sort of magnitude of the moment. The quality of a Christian is in their holiness through the humdrum, through the routine, through the daily thing that they're doing day in and day out. What is more difficult? Proclaiming God as you march to your death, or proclaiming God while living a life in decades of crippling pain? What's more difficult? What's more difficult? Taking a stand one time to pray a powerful prayer before thousands of people, or consistently praying alone for thousands of days? What's more difficult? Confessing before the whole world your own lack of holiness, or living a life of holiness before the world? Now, proclaiming God while we march to our deaths, praying before thousands, confessing our lack of holiness, these take bravery to do. These may very well take God working in our lives to be able to do these types of things. These are sort of the sensational things that we want to point to and say, wow, that's an amazing thing that God did. And we lift those up for people to see, and maybe God is working in those ways. But I have personally seen true holiness more clearly in Christians who are suffering for years of chronic pain, but have still exhibited joy and peace and a desire to share the truth and the love of God amidst all that pain, than in any pastor who just preaches on a stage. I've seen true holiness more clearly from Christians who happily and voluntarily have gone without for decades. They've just gone without, than any leader who maybe can stand up in front of a microphone speaking to millions. I've seen true holiness more clearly in Christians who will spend hours consistently in prayer year in and year out than any individual who can pray a single powerful prayer in front of a crowd. You see, the real evidence of God working is not in the sensational mountaintop experiences. Those things, honestly, are comparatively kind of easy. They're very short term. The real evidence of God's transforming work and power is in the daily grind. It's in the routine. It's in the humdrum. When you pull back the curtain on a person's life, whether it's yourself, whether it's somebody else, maybe it's on a church or on a ministry, make sure you are looking past what is sensational and what is exciting. We need to be sure to ask ourselves what the daily grind, what the humdrum thing what does that look like? Because it isn't the mountaintop experiences that give us a good indication of whether or not the soil they are planted in is good or not, or whether the roots of the individual or the ministry or the church have any depth to them. The best indicator of the quality of soil and the depth of the roots is in life in the humdrum. To produce a crop 100-fold, that takes very good soil. It takes time and diligence and hard work day in and day out. Routine in the humdrum to grow a bountiful, that 100-fold, that maturing crop And for a plant to last through the seasons, that plant has to have put in the hard work for those roots to grow really deep so that that plant has the staying power to remain. There's no way around it. There are no shortcuts to spiritual maturity. If the humdrum lacks holiness, plants may grow, they may look awesome, may look amazing for a moment. But if the soil isn't good, if the roots do not go deep, if the hard work has not been put in through the humdrum, then those plants are likely to wither and die shortly thereafter. The place where God is really working, that's in the quiet and often hidden of the humdrum. Now, please note, I'm not saying and suggesting that the entire Christian walk is this sort of routine, monotonous humdrum. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we won't or shouldn't expect those mountaintop types of experiences. We should. But an athlete only competes for a very short period of time, just a small amount of their time. Most of their time is in the hard work and the preparation for the competition. Most of their time is in the daily routine and the daily practice. And we are no different in our own spiritual walks. And the really cool part about this is that true spiritual maturity is not reserved for people with amazing talents or amazing giftedness. It's not reserved for just a few lucky individuals, a few lucky Christians with huge intellects or robust bodies that can somehow handle going through extreme situations and hard times. Spiritual maturity is accessible for everybody. It's accessible for everybody here who's here this morning. Because spiritual maturity is wrought in life during the humdrum. Spiritual maturity is built in our daily routines and the daily grind, our day in and our day out. Those small steps, sometimes very small steps, that we take towards Jesus. But because real, good soil, real spiritual maturity is not found in the momentary sensationalism. That's not where it is. Let's not be looking for God there. Let's not be hunting for the pastor or the church that's currently having the mountaintop of experience. I mean, regardless of how amazing or authentic that thing is. Rather, let's look to walk alongside those Christians who are diligently serving God by walking in holiness through the humdrum. And let's be those Christians ourselves. That's who we should be. And by doing that, we accomplish two things. First, this actually protects us from the sort of idolatry that Israel fell into. Had Israel not idolized Moses, they would not have been frantic in his absence. Had Israel sought after the holiness of God in their daily lives, had they been doing that day in and day out, it is much less likely that they would have accepted an idol and these idolatrous practices of worship as a substitute of worship of the one true God. Holiness in the humdrum protects us from idolatry. But the second thing is this. The second thing we accomplish by walking in holiness through the humdrum is lasting spiritual maturity and a bountiful spiritual harvest. Crash diets don't tend to result in long-term weight loss. Saving large amounts of money, just investing large amounts of money every once in a while doesn't tend to produce a retirement account that's going to really be there in the future. All the experts, they will tell you that for weight loss or financial gains, the best strategy is through regular small cutbacks and regular small investments. And the same thing is true of our spiritual walks. Our small steps, our regular holiness through the humdrum is most likely to produce the end goals of Christian maturity that we want. The process may be hard work. It may not be exciting all the time, but this is how we arrive, through the power of the Holy Spirit, at true spiritual maturity. We will get there through making these types of steps. Holiness through the humdrum produces spiritual maturity and a bountiful spiritual harvest. Now, last week I issued a challenge to the church, to all of you, myself as well, that is actually right along these same lines. The challenge was to sacrifice something in your life that either is unhealthy for you in some way, maybe spiritually, maybe physically, or maybe just something that's eating up your time and your energy that can be better used elsewhere. So the challenge was to sacrifice something, and then it was to bring something into your life that was beneficial to you in an eternal sense. And again, it didn't have to be anything huge. It could have been simple, like committing to a little bit more prayer, showing up in church. Could even include solitude. That's what I was focusing on this past week. But the idea was to bring something into your life that would consistently draw you closer to God and into Christian service, to bring you closer in your walk with holiness with Him. If you accepted that challenge, how did it go this week? How did things go? It's okay if you didn't do that perfectly, or maybe you didn't have a chance to really engage in that. But if you did, how did it go? And remember, this is about celebrating the small steps. These are the small steps forward that we want to celebrate. It's not about feeling guilty because you didn't quite do it as successfully as you wanted, or you didn't do it the way you wanted in some way to accomplish the end result. It's not about feeling guilty about things that we don't do quite as well. This is about celebrating the steps forward. And I'm actually going to reissue that challenge again for this week, for this coming week, because, again, it fits right into what we're talking about, holiness through the humdrum. And maybe you need to tweak what it was that you were doing a little bit. Maybe you need to change something up. But let's keep it going. Let's keep moving in this direction towards God. Let's continue this walk upwards towards being the men and the women who God wants us to be. The men or women who are seeking the long-term, lasting spiritual maturity through these small daily steps of holiness. Let's be that good soil. Let's be ready so that we can produce that harvest of 100-fold. Please join me in prayer.